All right, welcome everyone. This is now our 11th meeting of the Housing Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee. And today is going to be our initial dive into Goal 14 and the transition from Goal 10 to Goal 14. Just to recap, in our first 10 meetings, we spent a lot of time on Goal 10. We covered buildable land inventories, talked about constraints and housing capacity. We talked about development-ready lands and public facilities and the translation of needed housing. So appreciate all of your thoughts and comments and sharing your experiences, excuse me, as we talked through that topic, and as we've discussed, we'll see that see proposed draft rules after the legislative session that we can revisit those topics. But thank you for all your help in giving staff the guidance that they need to draft those rules. Yeah, so today we're going to be looking at the Goal 10 to Goal 14 process, and Beth is going to kick us off with a presentation just to either refresh your memories on some of the key steps in that process, or for those who are not as familiar to cover the process so that we all start in roughly the same place. And then we'll move into a conversation about what aspects or elements of that process are in need of additional clarity or certainty for the jurisdictions that follow them and use them. And particularly, we're looking at determining land need and a response to a deficiency in land supply that a jurisdiction might encounter, or subsequently, the process of establishing a study area and evaluating the land within that study area for urban growth boundary expansion. So that's what we're doing today. And I'm going to hand it over to Karen to talk through our racial equity framework focus areas and to cover anything that I may have missed, just in case.
Yeah, I'm going to cover a couple of things, but I'll start with the racial equity framework, and I couldn't pick one at this time. We have not revisited, oh, and look at this, and I did it wrong. I meant to highlight benefits and burdens and measuring and evaluating outcomes. I'm not sure how that was an oversight on my part, but we have not visited benefits and burdens since about the spring of this year, really thinking about what tools within the land use paradigm are within a jurisdiction's ability to address some of those historical inequities and the benefits and burdens in their community. And then what does that look like when we think about the outcomes and continuous improvement, and what a jurisdiction is attempting to accomplish with our land use planning program. So when we think about the historical harms and we think about segregation, or we think about concentrations of poverty, it's really interesting specifically now where we're at with rules on housing and urbanization to think about measures like upzoning, other land use efficiency measures for minimum density or minimum lot sizes, whether you have those or not, and really thinking about who benefits from these types of land use regulations and who has disproportionately had the least access to benefit, or who's been excluded from some of those benefits when we think about how land is used within our urban areas. And then when we think about the outcomes that we want, we've talked quite a bit about how do we track development trends? How do we look at changes in density in our city? And what might we need? What assistance could we seek from the state, particularly when we think about smaller communities with rural environments, or smaller staff, or shared staff where you're depending on county planners, or you share a planning agency across council of governments. And so thinking about all of the different types of choices that are made under our land use regulations and how that achieves the outcomes or falls short of the community planning and community development outcomes that we're seeking. And I thought I would ground us real quick. So we've spent a lot of time on Goal 10 and Goal and moving into our urbanization goal 14 work. And I wanted to ground us in the charter. So when we think about what we were legislatively directed to do and the charge that we have received from the Land Conservation and Development Commission, I thought I would just highlight a couple statements for us. All of you have it linked in your packet if you want to read it in full. But the charge is for us as a technical advisory committee to look at options and policy alternatives that we can recommend to our RAC. And the staff will work with the RAC to bring this to LCDC for adoption. And how do we bring about greater clarity and certainty in both the adoption and acknowledgement of our housing and urbanization related processes? This includes, within what we're working on now and where we are in this process, rules and guidance that provide greater clarity and certainty in relationship to our urbanization work for both housing and to facilitate a UGB amendment where a need is identified. So here we are, when you need to identify a land deficiency, what does that mean if there is a lack of capacity on your land? What does that mean if there is a lack of land, sufficient land to meet a housing need? And we are tasked with looking at where can we amend or revise our existing rules to provide greater clarity and greater certainty in those processes. I think that leads us right into, let me go back. That'll lead us right into Beth's work. And I think, Beth, you will take us at a high level overview with an example of the city of Turner on what that looks like to go through our goal 10 into our goal 14 process.
Yeah, and this is just meant to be illustrative. These analyses are different for every different city, of course. So I'm gonna take us through this in about 10 to 15 minutes. So Turner is a small city of a little less than 2,500 people, or about 2,500 people, just south and east of Salem. When we worked with Turner, we did a housing capacity analysis, a housing needs analysis, as it was called at the time, to look at whether Turner had enough land. So getting into the land need determination. And this is a diagram that just explains the thinking about this. They didn't have enough land, so then we looked at what are called land use efficiency measures. So policy changes to increase the efficiency of land use within the urban growth boundary. And they still didn't have enough land. So then we went into the urban growth boundary expansion analysis. So while this presentation focuses more on the UGB, the goal 14 pieces, all of the goal 10 pieces are sitting behind it as well. So this is just a little simplified thing that we put together to help their city council understand the process. So briefly, Turner was forecast to grow by about 1,235 people, or adding 507 new dwelling units. When we looked at their capacity of their existing buildable land, including vacant and partially vacant unconstrained land, we found that they had capacity within their urban growth boundary for about 189 dwelling units. Their demand, once we accounted for a few other things, ended up being 497. So they had a deficit of about 308 dwelling units, or 73 acres of land. So looking at that, we thought about land use efficiency measures, and we worked with their city council around a number of different land use efficiency measures. Turner was too small at the time to be to fall under any of the missing middle housing pieces, and they were just getting big enough to the point where they had to allow accessory dwelling units. So we looked at ways to allow all these different types of housing units, and then to take their minimum lot sizes down to smaller minimum lot sizes within their existing zones. We also looked at a few other measures, one of which was to stop requiring garages, which would have made housing more affordable, but it wasn't a land use efficiency measure in a pure land use efficiency measure way, but wow, did that start blowing up the project. People were very, very desperately concerned by that. So we left that out. When we came back and said, okay, going from that 73 acres what efficiency does this get us? And what we found is it reduced the deficit to 255 dwelling units or 49 acres of land. So they had that deficit. So as we were going into the urban growth boundary analysis, we were looking for about 49 acres of unconstrained buildable land outside of their urban growth boundary. And goal 14 requires you to identify your preliminary study areas, to identify the final specific study areas, and then look at the prioritization of land for bringing into the UGB along what we've called here this prioritization scheme. Since then, it changed just a little bit. This is about 3 years old, and so it's minorly different at this point. And then you've got your study areas, which we'll talk about in a moment or two. Then you go into the goal 14 locational factor analysis, looking at all of the study areas against each other. And the goal 14 factors are listed down here. Accommodating, efficient accommodation of identified land need, orderly and economic provision of public facilities and services. You can see how that would certainly tie into pretty closely the idea of development ready land, comparative environmental, energy, and economic and social consequences, and then compatibility of proposed urban uses with nearby agricultural and forest land. So you have to evaluate all of your final study areas against those factors. So looking through this at the high level, I've actually fixed the prioritization scheme. This is the current one, since we did this work. So urban reserves, Turner didn't have any urban reserves. Exceptions land and non-resource land. I'll show you in a moment how there was no exceptions land that was accessible to Turner, and they didn't have any non-resource land. Marginal land is the third priority. There's none in Marion County. Farm and forest lands that were not predominantly high value, there was none right around Turner, of course. And then high value farm and forest lands. And that's what we were looking at predominantly. So we established our study area for cities smaller than 10,000. You look at all land within 1/2 mile of the urban growth boundary. And then you look at all exception zoning, and exception zoning is land that is zoned in county zones, like rural residential sorts of zones. You look at all exceptions land within a mile. I'll note that this is the Salem urban growth boundary. So that was where we first started. And then we started looking at what are all of the development constraints. And we used the same development constraints that we used in the buildable lands inventory. So floodways, floodplains, steep slopes, areas of very high landslide. Those were all considered constraints here. And then we started looking at all of the land within 1/2 mile, which you're required to do. And some of that land, the land that was just plain in development constraints or say part of Salem, we said you don't have to consider those because we're not considering Salem as part of our UGB. We're not considering bringing in large areas of floodplain. This over here was a gravel mine, a gravel pit that was being actively mined. And so you can see how these gray areas, they're all sort of segmented off from Turner's urban growth boundary. You'd have to, go over a floodplain or over a steep slope or over landslide hazards to get to them. And so we said, okay, those are areas that we won't be exploring for UGB expansion. And then we put all of the rest of the areas that were not predominantly in constrained areas into areas, labeled A through H probably. And these are the study areas that we used. It was more than twice the unmet land need, more than twice 40 acres, 49 acres rather, which was part of the requirement. And so then we started getting into soil types and classifying land. So there's a lot of complication in how you look at high value farmland. It's partially about the soil types, and in the Willamette Valley, it's very detailed. You're also looking at other definitions of prime farmland, and then Turner has areas that are within the Willamette Valley viticultural area, which is considered prime farmland also. So you can see that the highest value soils were here in the maroon colors. The green is sort of the medium part, the class 3 soils rather. And then the mint color were some of the lesser important soils. Now in doing this, let me see, what do I have here? Yes, next. We knew that in Turner here, you've got an industrial area here to the south that isn't well developed, in part because of need for some infrastructure that they haven't been able to build. We're looking for housing. We also knew going into this that providing services, so water and wastewater, to the south area would be among some of the most expensive. And we also knew that there was active farming in this area, and people didn't want to see this active farmland come in. We also knew that, we didn't want Turner to connect with Salem. So there's some problems up there. So we, avoided that. And then we had a sense of how these different areas here connected into existing neighborhoods, and where services would be more possible. So looking at each of these areas, we ruled out area A because adjacent to Salem and very high farmland, high value farmland. Area E, F, and G were difficult to service. The legal standard is impracticable to service. We worked with their engineers to determine the cost of servicing those areas compared to the costs of the other areas here that were coming up highest. And then looked at the cost of services between area B and C, and determined that area D was best suited for UGB expansion, because it has roads stubbed out to it. It's got sewer stubbed out to it in a number of places, and there's actually a water pipe that wasn't a legal water pipe, but had been done a long time ago, that went across area D, even though it wasn't serving people in area D. That is like the high level 100 pages of findings consolidated into just a few minutes. One of the more important things in this was getting to this idea of impracticable to serve, and where it would just cost a lot more to service than some of the other areas, which, like I said, leads into questions about development ready land. So then area D was too big, so we had to work with the city to determine which parts of area D were more suitable, and that was also working with landowners, that kind of thing. And there was a little bit of public land for Salem because this is their reservoir right there. And that is, in the end, how the Turner UGB was expanded to include a portion of this notch over here. And I think that ends my show and tell.
Thanks, Beth. Does anyone have any questions? People, like I said, are probably more or less familiar with that process, but we thought it would be helpful to revisit. Mary Kyle.
Thanks, Beth. That was really great. And not so much a question about that process. We'll have discussions about how it translates into now that we have ONA, but the next step, which is, how was that land zoned and planned for infrastructure to ensure it met the needed housing?
Well,
maybe you weren't, I don't know if you were involved with that.
Well, this is what zoning we'd planned on, and what it was, I think it wasn't being annexed into the city immediately. I can't quite remember because this was like 3 years ago. But this was the zoning plan we had for it. And then the infrastructure services were happening after this project was
Okay.
done. So I like to say, per the work we did with Bend, the easy part is getting land into the UGB.
Right.
The hard part is getting the infrastructure.
Right. And as we translate this to Ona, how do we make sure it's actually going to provide the housing that we've identified? So thanks.
Those are good questions.
Yeah, thank you. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. Beth, I had a question, and you can keep this as high level as you need to, about looking at boundary location factor number 4 regarding nearby agricultural activities that were occurring on adjacent EFU lands. And can you summarize how you categorize them and kind of like weighed the potential impacts of urban uses on those adjacent farming activities?
Well, first of all, we figured out if there was adjacent farming activities and what they were. So for instance, one of the things I remember is out east of Area I, there was really some good farming activities going on. And as I said, there was active farming down in this area, I think maybe especially in Area F. And so we knew some of what was going on. I don't remember there being anything exciting going on up here, and that's not surprising, you know, adjacent to, because of the constraints. And so in the end, part of what was considered is that there wasn't a lot of active farming going on Area I. And so Area D certainly wouldn't be impacting adjacent farm activities. Where we've done this in other places, we look at farm activities such as rangeland. That's a pretty common one. Um, and the compatibility between rangeland and housing, I mean, obviously you don't want them, you know, right next to each other. But if there can be some buffer, then that's, you know, I think one of the lesser big compatibility issues. You can keep your cows and your steer out of your residential neighborhoods. And then it all depends on what else is going on and how intense it is. And of course, water sources will matter if you're talking about irrigation. But of course, you shouldn't be using irrigation water for urban development. Does that help at all?
No, it does. Thank you very much for that.
Mm-hmm.
Al, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Beth, just a terrific presentation. I wonder if you could just maybe take another 30 seconds or a minute to tell us a little bit how you struggled with the impracticability issue. I know that there's a Luba decision involving the Deer Village not far from there, where the issue was, you know, the impracticability of getting across the road and up the hill. And they looked at that, and I believe either Luba or the Court of Appeals said it was okay to decide to stay on one side of the highway. Um, I don't know if whether or not the potential for funding, the possibility or the probability of funding is relevant, or whether the 20-year time frame is relevant. What'd you look at?
So we looked at their engineers' high-level costs of services. And so this is a small city. They don't have a lot of budget. So I guess implicitly we did consider funding. And I seem to remember it was a couple $1 million. Let's just call it, you know, servicing this area, E and F, more than G, because G wasn't a contender in quite the same way. But E and F, you know, couple $1 million compared to couple $100,000 in area D. And so we originally started talking about the higher costs here, and then DLCD asked us to provide costs more for areas B, D, and C also, because we'd already ruled out A, H, and I by the time we got there. So so it was high level engineering estimates. It wasn't a great deal of detailed analysis.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Beth. And maybe we can I don't know, we'll see how it goes, but maybe we can keep your presentation, or do we have a DLCD presentation, Karen? No,
No, we have some transition slides, but I don't think they're necessary.
I just thought that some of Beth's slides might come in handy as we dive into this conversation. So maybe we'll keep it up for now, Beth. Thank you.
Yep. Tell me where you'd like to go when you're ready.
Oh, Corey's got a question.
Just a follow-up to that answer, Beth. So how common is it, would you say? So you said, obviously every city is different, but you used high-level engineering estimates to kind of help get at that question of impracticability and what's impractical or not. And so have you found that that's something you commonly use? Like, was it unique here? Like, just want to get a sense of like how often that is used as the proxy for answering that kind of question.
I only do so many UGB amendments. I think Kevin might be able to answer us better, maybe. But my guess it's in at least a third, maybe half. It's really important. But I mean, if I was to select of the 4 locational criteria, which one would weigh heaviest in my mind if I was a city? Funding, cost of utilities has to be right up there. The other ones make a lot of sense to consider. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they're not important, but that one speaks to the pocketbook.
Kevin, did you have anything to add?
Sure, I'm happy to add, although Beth has been doing this a lot longer than I have, so I have a lot of respect for her experience in this realm. Yeah, it is not unusual to see arguments made on infrastructure, and I think it's important to note there's a couple of places that comes in. So in the rules, when you're putting together your preliminary study area, there's some provisions that say, hey, if you can't serve it, you can take those areas out of consideration. That sets a pretty high bar. There is a definition for, or there's a language in the rule, and I'll drop the link, the citation in the chat that basically says, in terms of looking at impracticable to serve, here's some things that cities can do in terms of demonstrating that. And I think what Beth just explained in terms of Turner's analysis was right in line with that work. So that allows you to exclude some areas where serviceability is really an issue, even before you start looking at comparative, areas. So if you take that out of the study area, then when you get to that final process where you're weighing and balancing those goal 14 factors, yeah, I think local governments can also look at serviceability in the mix of, other considerations like compatibility with agricultural operations. So there's a couple of different places in the process where this comes into play. Oh, good. Yeah, thank you, Karen. That's the citation precisely from Division 24. So that's all I had to say to add.
And this was our first hit at doing what Kevin was saying. It's just silly to consider serving something that's over a ridge.
Great. Beth, maybe you can go back to the very beginning to the process, the flowchart slide. Maybe that would be good context, because our first topic of conversation is what aspects of the rules for determining land need and responding to a deficiency of land might need certainty or clarity from people's perspectives. So when do you know if a city has enough land and it's zoned to sufficient capacity to accommodate 20 years of housing need? And we didn't get a whole lot of activity on the mural board, so hopefully we'll get a little bit more after the meeting. But here are some topics that staff dropped into the mural board, and then we did have a little bit of participation from others. One topic is determining the housing type mix needed. One is having quantifiable validation to depart from density expectations. And then measures and actions that either that can demonstrably increase housing capacity or produce needed housing. Beth has those that slide or that box in the flow chart in the upper right-hand side that talks about efficiency measures, looking inside the urban growth boundary before looking to expand the urban growth boundary. And then we had a few other notes that people dropped in of things that they wanted to see discussed One is estimating capacity on part vacant, redevelopable, and mixed use lands. The other, how and the level of effort that's needed to determine that additional capacity is needed. So some of that's a little bit repetitive, but those are some of the topics that people identified that they'd like to see us cover in the coming weeks or months as we talk about Goal 14. So I'm going to open it up to the group here in response to those items. If you want to look at the Miro board or other aspects of determining land need that you've experienced, maybe either share your experience or share with us a particular issue that you'd like to discuss more. And if you have addressed it or been successful in addressing it, we'd want to hear those success stories too, because we're always looking for best practices. So let's start with the land determination piece of the puzzle.
Steve, could you state the
Oh, go
question
ahead,
for those of us who don't have the Miro board up and weren't able to look at it again? I mean, what part
Yeah,
about land
it's in the
determination again?
chat.
Sorry, that was a lot.
No,
that you listed.
sorry, I ramble sometimes. So
Right.
looking at the beginning of this chart that Beth
That
has,
one,
the
the
housing
housing
needs
need
analysis,
Got it.
and I think into the efficiency measures. So in determining the land determination process, what are the aspects of that people think need clarity or where jurisdictions need more certainty to come out of this rulemaking process? And the what I mentioned on the Miro board were just different people's ideas on what they wanted to discuss, whether that was department staff or whoever took the time to chime in and post some sticky notes.
If you want me to toss that Miro board up on my screen, I can do that.
I think Jenna just dropped the link.
Okay.
Maybe someone from the department could talk about the sticky notes that you put in the Miro board to get us started, Karen.
Yeah, in this example with Turner, I think, Beth, you had worked with the city and when they did their BLI and did their capacity analysis, they came up with a need of 73 additional residential acres. And then you further worked with the city and you shared with us some of those land use efficiency measures, other measures as well that may not be strictly land use efficiency. And so here at the department, amongst a variety of housing staff across urbanization and our broader housing division, we've been chatting about which land use efficiency measures will we see within an HCA, and then we may also see in a housing production strategy. And there are some land use efficiency measures that over time have evolved. Maybe there were some regulatory policies that could be passed that were considered land use efficiency measures for permitting, things of that nature, maybe SDC waivers, things of that nature that are facilitating development. But then there are those more, I would say, pure, for lack of a better word, your pure land use efficiency measures. They're really reducing the acreage. So Beth, you mentioned that doing away with the requirement of garages. Maybe that's not a pure land use efficiency measure, but maybe it could create more housing or at least lower cost housing, and it's facilitating housing production. But the land use efficiency measures that Turner did bring down their acreage from 73 to 49 acres. So really thinking about land use efficiency measures in the context of what does that do for a land need? And what does that do for greater housing production versus more affordable housing? There's a variety of ways to slice and dice this. And I'm wondering if the group feels our rules are perfectly clear and they provide a great deal of certainty and we don't need to revise the rules on this. Or if the group feels like, there's an opportunity here based on the charge we were given from our commission and legislative direction.
Mary Kyle. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks. So this really, I think, follows up on what Karen was saying, that as we shift to own or integrate ONA into this, I think we have to start changing are thinking about efficiency measures, because that reflects the old way of doing things. And I know some things are in statute and some things are in rules, and but putting that aside, where these words are. Because efficiency is just really about counting units, or that's how it's been implemented, I think, in the past, counting so many housing units of multifamily or single family or whatever. And with ONA, we really have to be addressing housing need by income level, which has a relationship to some relationship in some situations to the type of housing unit, but it's more than that. So I think we really have to start talking about those housing production strategies, in addition to just the number counting of housing units and those efficiency measures, and thinking about those other tools. I would call, whether a garage is required, a land use measure. I remember getting a call from an affordable housing provider from a mid-Willamette Valley County in 1992 saying that there was a city that was requiring attached or garages at least, and wasn't going to let them build carports. And that is a Goal 10 violation. And that's what I told her. And she used it to advocate for that. So I think that is clearly a Goal 10 issue, the affordability of housing. And we have been talking in the housing production strategy about a whole bunch of stuff that's land use adjacent, and it's zoning codes. Some of it might be building codes. So I really think we have, like off-street parking, we have to be talking about those things here for both efficiency, for whether you're counting numbers or filling, the various income buckets, as well as affordability. So, so anyway, that's just a comment of how we make that evolution to integrate the ONA analysis and housing production strategies into what has been more of a numbers counting under efficiency. So I think that's it for my thoughts on that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to try not to repeat everything Mary Kyle just said, but I wanted to stress the new work I think cities will be doing to look not just at numbers of units, but looking at I think getting more specific about types and locations and how those decisions will help meet our housing needs by price, by rent level, tied to area median income and affordability. So I think part of this work on looking at capacity and estimating capacity and those opportunities to be more efficient also needs to address whether those decisions are not just going to be density based, but also how this is going to meet our needs for housing that's affordable to households that have 0 to 30% area median income. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Al?
Thanks. I would just add one more thing, I guess, to what Damien Ray Kyle said, which is that I think in addition to clarity and certainty, we're looking for fit and we're looking for effectiveness in actually implementing the ONAs and implementing the housing needs analyses, so that when we are adding land to urban growth boundaries, it's land that addresses the need that has been identified, and not just a general quantitative need by type or just without any relationship to how affordable it might be. And I think that there's a very important link in Goal 14, at least comes out a couple of places, but I think it comes in factors 1 and 3 of the Goal 14 factors, in particular having to do with economic and social consequences. And I think that that is reflected in Ben's urban growth boundary expansion last time, where they took in land that came in with commitments of various kinds to affordability that other lands didn't. And that became a factor. It wasn't decisive, but it was a factor in deciding what land came in. So I think those would be highly relevant things. We just don't want to bring in the land that is easiest to bring in and is going to end up just going for kind of housing that really isn't the housing that we're looking for.
Thank you, Al. Heather, go ahead. Did you hear me, Heather? Go right ahead. You have your hand
Heather's
raised?
muted.
Oh, that's what it is. I couldn't see that. We can't hear you. Now I see that you're muted. And now unmuted, but I don't hear, we don't hear you for some reason. Karen, go ahead. We'll come back to Heather.
Heather, I'm gonna jump in ahead of you, sorry, and wait for you to come back connect with us. So I'm wondering how folks, there's rules currently, and it's probably in statute as well, but I don't know the statute is, I don't have the statute in front of me. But section 50, subsection 4, so division 24, we're within division 24. Prior to expanding the UGB, a local government must demonstrate that the estimated needs cannot reasonably be accommodated on land already inside the UGB. And I think at some point, the example of Turner, they had to come to that determination that within their UGB, they could accommodate 20 some acres of needed, and they could do efficiency measures to reduce that acreage needed. And one of the questions pending for myself, at least, is which actions are land use efficiency measures because they contribute to a simple math equation of increasing density and decreasing acreages of land needed in expansion, versus which actions are maybe production strategies and they get at the needed housing that Damien spoke to of, I need a certain type of housing, I need certain characteristics of that housing, and I need to meet certain affordability needs in my community, and I need to realize how to produce that housing. And I think it's an interesting question when we think about the equity framework that we started this, is under ONA, cities will be contextualizing their housing need. Where do I need this housing? Do I see concentrations of naturally occurring affordable housing, concentrations of regulated affordable housing in my southwest corner or in my northeast corner? And do I need that greater housing mix throughout my city in various neighborhoods? And so there is a locational factor when we think about where we adopt efficiency measures. And then for me, the question is which efficiency measures, to what degree, and where do we reach that we have demonstrated what we can reasonably accommodate within the existing UGB?
Oh, I was just gonna see if Heather's back. Can you try to talk again? We'll see if it works, Heather. Unfortunately, no. 'Tis a mystery. Well, if you have the time to type, oh wait, did you? Your comment is that you think we need to address the 3% cap on efficiency measure capacity in the context of the new ONA need and affordability by income level. And so I think we're hearing, thanks, Karen, for your comments. I think we're, we've heard some consistency across what we heard from Mary Kyle and Damien and Al thus far in terms of going beyond counting numbers and getting to issues like affordability and access. Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, just to kind of build on that theme of sort of how things were done in the past versus how they're going to be done now around efficiency measures. Something that's coming up for me that I just wanted to kind of put in the room is that I think there's other, related rulemakings that also have what are going to be new efficiency measures for cities embedded, right? And I'm talking about CFEC, I'm talking about 30% of current and future housing need in CFAs, rules around removing parking minimums. And so I think it's, adjacent to what we're talking about and describing here, that it's kind of going to be a new ball game with efficiency measures. And I think there's some related and adjacent things that are also going to be in play in this kind of bucket that, are kind of outside of this ONA rulemaking, but I think very much related to an efficiency measures conversation.
Thanks, Corey. And of course, those CFEC requirements don't apply to all of our jurisdictions, but certainly for some, those will play a big part and are, right, aligned with efficiency measures. Mary Kyle?
So I think, trying to get I think, is it just Karen who who asked this question about, I think, cities, regardless of what, population they are, have to comply with goal 10, and those that are over 10,000 have to comply with, the housing production strategies. But I think those housing production strategies also provide, guidelines for what other cities should be looking at to comply with goal 10. And so I think the issues like the way we've done things, through looking just at efficiency measures, and I just don't think there's a bright line between efficiency measures and housing production strategies, but in any event, to go beyond what we've been doing so far, we need to incorporate those housing production strategy type analysis, which could be eliminating the requirement for a garage or off-street parking or providing density bonuses or SDC waivers, or, there's a lot of strategies. And I think it's a matter of looking at which of those are realistic for a city turner small, but I think it's actually in the Salem metropolitan area. So I think CFEC does apply to them maybe, but looking at what are realistic and meet their housing needs by income levels, because regardless of size, they're going to be getting those housing allocations. And so then taking that next step beyond the way we've done things and looking at the housing production strategies, which are kind of both pure land use and land use adjacent, and then seeing where that leaves you. And I think at that point or sometime closely thereafter, I think is when you get to Heather's question of, well, how much do you account for might be produced that way, but in housing, but that you really have to go beyond into those housing production strategies.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. And I know, we've already had some distinguishing or not between efficiency measures and production strategies. That's probably one thing that we'll spend some time on. And I think specifically one of the Miro board comments from DLCD, and I know something practitioners have struggled with is,
It's a continuum.
Well, and being able to quantify things.
Mhm.
And I understand what you said before about not wanting to get into a game of counting units, but what measures are quantifiable in terms of their impact and which ones are not. Before we go to Brock, I wanted to call on Beth real quick. She had a comment.
So I was reflecting back to what I've heard with Damien and Al around what Bend did in expanding their UGB and having worked on some of the other expansion areas in Bend. So maybe there's a new category of land use efficiency measures, which is related to agreements when land is brought into the UGB about it developing with certain types of housing or, certain affordable housing requirements. So, to be annexed, Ashland requires a certain amount of affordable housing on land that's going to annex, or maybe there's development agreements. So maybe that's a new category of land use efficiency measure.
Thank you, Beth. Go ahead, Brock.
I have my hand up, but I think I'm gonna think on it some before I talk.
That is your right to withdraw your hand.
I'm wondering, I'm seeing a little activity on the Miro board, and Heather brought it up. I'm wondering if I can invite Kevin. Kevin, you shared with us in the context of a buildable lands inventory. When we think about, I'm trying to remember what it is now. It's 6B, around that 3% cap, our statute, and where there's a variety of choices. I'm trying to think through both land efficiency measures or production strategies. There's a variety of choices that don't apply, that 3% cap doesn't apply to. So I recall in May when you shared with us, the methodologies for estimating capacity and applying this statute, what it does apply to and then what it doesn't. And I remember you sharing the origins of this statute, why this was written into statute. And I'm wondering if we could make that clarification at this point.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, so the 3% cap part of the statute, and this is in statute, it came with the Middle Housing Bill, HB 2001, 2019, I think. And essentially it says that in estimating capacity, local governments can't assume that a particular measure will yield more than a 3% increase unless the local government can provide quantifiable validation that, there would be a greater than 3% increase. So that's in statute now. I will say that as our staff have kind of looked at that provision and discussed it internally, our feeling is that there are certain actions that we don't believe would be subject to the 3% cap. One obvious one is a zone change. So if a city is seeing a need, for example, for more high density land, and they have a surplus of low density land, if they rezone some of that low density land for high densities, they can assume they're going to achieve the same density level that they're getting in their high density zone. The 3% cap would not apply. There are some other changes that I think would fall into that category. I have kind of a short list here of, if you're reducing your minimum lot size, you're going to increase the potential yield of, housing, particularly in a low density residential kind of zone where you're predominantly seeing detached single units. And so if that's a significant change, I don't think that would be subject to the 3% cap. Another measure that we see cities do is to put in place minimum residential densities. Some cities don't have those requirements, but putting that in place can have a pretty significant increase in achieved densities. So, it's really that quantifiable validation issue. There are other circumstances we could think of where a city could make that case, but some of these other actions, it's pretty, I think pretty apparent that, they would not be subject to the 3% cap. I don't know if does that get at it?
Yeah, I'm hoping that clarifies. I'll check in with Heather and others who've mentioned that.
Heather, you have your hand raised.
Can you hear me?
Yay!
Yay! Sorry, I've been having computer issues. Yes, we've talked about that, and I think we're in agreement. Those not that you necessarily need us to be in agreement, but I think we're in agreement that those efficiency measures that are more quantifiable, that makes sense. It's the other ones, right, which I think is where the cities are really going to have to start looking at those even more, those financial incentives, those other reductions to barriers, like Mary Kyle was mentioning earlier. A lot of those things that you might otherwise think of as just being HPS strategies are really some of the areas or some of the actions that cities are going to need to rely on to reduce barriers to housing. And particularly with the financial incentives, we can do a market analysis, we can do a redevelopment analysis and plug in some of those financial incentives, and we still have to then make an assumption about how much additional capacity we think we can get that is really kind of outside of that market study, because that's just kind of showing you that it's feasible, but then how much do you assume over 20 years? And I just see a bit of a challenge there as far as if you're running out of tools, and then also how those tools with the cap relate to the income buckets that we're looking to fill housing in. So, I appreciate that, and I think that's great that we do have those actions that are clear, that staff is in agreement that those shouldn't be subject to the cap. But I think it's all those other ones that I'd be curious to see if we could look at a way to make it so that if you have if you can demonstrate that you think you have good, solid findings in some way, that you can exceed that 3%, because I think that there probably are reasons to be able to do that.
Thank you,
Just
Heather. I'm glad you
follow
found
up.
your voice. Go ahead, Kevin.
I'm sorry, Steve, didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, I'm so glad can hear you now. I want to be clear too. I think there's been some question about whether a city's housing mix is subject to the 3% cap. I don't believe so. No. And understand that my perspective on the 3% cap is really in the context of UGB expansions. That's kind of what I've been spending a lot of my time on. So I look at those efficiency measures, what local governments can and cannot assume. And that really is directly pointed at estimating land needs for UGB expansions. There are a lot of other housing production strategies that are absolutely critical to provide a greater mix of housing types, more, different affordability levels and all of that stuff. Those are very important, and I'm not undercutting their significance. In terms of how the current paradigm works, though, that efficiency measures piece is really, at least as we've operationalized it, it has to do with before a city expands its urban growth boundary, they need to take a good look, a good faith effort at what are some things that we can put in place to make more efficient use of our current lands before we expand the UGB. And it's one part. We think that those efficiency measures definitely live within the greater body of housing production strategies, but they're not, in my opinion, one and the same. I don't know. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks, Kevin. I want to call on Beth, and then I'd like to move on to our second topic of discussion.
So Kevin implicitly made a comment there that I want to follow up on. It's about timing. So an HPS action presumably would be done sometime in the future, unless the city happened to be working on it now. But sometime in the future, whereas a land use efficiency measure has to be done before they expand their UGB. And that's been, I think, fairly clear over, guidance over the last few years. And so how would you count HPS actions that haven't yet been done, but the city is going to do as an efficiency measure? And some of the things that Heather was talking about in terms of, financial incentives, that kind of thing, those might be in the future, 2 or 3 years off.
That's a very good question. I don't know that I have an answer. I think one of the things that really drives that issue is the concurrency requirement, the current requirement under statute and legal precedent that a city cannot adopt a housing capacity analysis that identifies a deficit without at the same time addressing that deficit, whether it's with an efficiency measure or with a UGB expansion or some combination of the two. And that pushes the timing that you're speaking to, Beth. So just be aware that is a context that we're operating under. I don't know if it's within our purview, if it's possible for us to look at that concurrency requirement, but it is something that we've started to discuss a little internally, whether that's even legally viable. And whether it's a good policy idea as well.
Thanks, Beth and Kevin. Beth, if you could scroll to the slide when you show a little bit more about the Goal 14 process. It might have been more than one slide, but yeah, that one right there. That's the one I was thinking of. And then we can flip to the Goal 14 factors if we need to. But the second topic of conversation today, essentially the same question, but focused on a different part of the process. So what aspects of the rules to establish a study area and evaluate land under Goal 14 could use greater clarity or certainty? So how and where a city amends its urban growth boundary to accommodate that land need. And from the mural board, I haven't checked it. There's probably, oh, I don't see anything too much in addition, but we had from staff, clarity on marginal lands, removal of unsuitable land, which we've talked about a little bit, and the level of analysis for those location factors, how much analysis is sufficient. And then we had a few additions. One, how to address existing rural subdivisions. So I think that gets into those exception lands that Beth showed us in the study area and adjacent to the Turner study area. And then what is serviceable or not, which we've kind of touched on as well. So again, I'll start by opening it up to the group. You know, what's your experience been with this process? What have you identified as aspects that need some more clarity or that you struggled with and maybe found a solution to that you want to share with the group? And we'll start with Brock.
So, and I don't know if anyone on the call has a lot of expertise with this particular question, I guess, but for cities that do have established urban reserves, how often is it that a city will go into a UGB expansion for residential purposes and find that their required acreage expansion is less than the total acreage of the urban reserve, and how often is it higher? Because I think, and what I'm trying to get to here is like, if a city has an established urban reserve, right, which is supposed to be the next spot that's going to develop, right, do they need to go through the half-mile process around the rest of the city if they know that that urban reserve has enough land for that expansion? So, you know, because it would already be considered first, right? And if the acreage is there, it seems like that would be the optimal place to go without having to do the rest of that study, because that's why those lands were identified as urban reserves in the first place. So just kind of a streamline of the analysis process there.
Looks like Beth has an answer, and then I was also gonna see if Ted Reed might know from Metro's experience kind of how often that occurs, but go ahead, Beth.
We did this with a land swap for Madras recently, and they've got kind of an enormous urban reserve. And so I think we had a lot of different study areas. They were really focused in the urban reserve area. So we had to, we had to do the whole half acre piece. And pardon me, we were looking at urban reserves and exceptions areas, certainly. But it was an easy analysis in the end, because we got to look at all the urban reserve areas at the same level of priority. So we got to evaluate which one made more sense based on the goal 14 criteria. So it was way easier in a lot of ways. There was gobs of land that we didn't have to look at that point. So there was one area, and it just made sense. They had a gap, and it would connect in with, an existing area that was being planned and where there was infrastructure and that kind of thing. So it's way easier. But urban reserves can be awfully big. And that poses another minor problem, which is that your sub areas can't be bigger than 100 acres. And so if you've got a 4,000 acre urban reserve, there's a lot of 100 acres in there. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Beth. And also important to remember that, not everybody has urban reserves.
Right.
Ted, do you have any, initial thoughts on how often a jurisdiction, I know that, there's a cyclical process, but how often jurisdictions have looked to expand but not take up an entire urban reserve area, I think is what part of Brock's question was.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In Metro's case, region-wide, our urban reserves are extensive. I think it's somewhere around 20,000 acres right now. So no, we're not in a circumstance where we are bumping up against the sort of maximum acreage of those. I think it's been a mix in terms of how our cities do their concept planning for some of these urban reserves. In some cases, they've planned an entire reserve because it made sense in terms of infrastructure phasing, and then in other cases, they've planned for a portion of it. Steve, you may also have some insight into this just in your work with cities.
Yeah, I was just thinking, again, I'm not familiar with too many cities' urban reserves outside of Metro, but for instance, Sherwood has kind of multiple urban reserves, right? To the north, Sherwood West is obviously being discussed right now, but they have other urban reserve areas to the north that they're not looking to. So,
Yeah, that's correct. And to the south.
Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously if your urban reserve acreage exceeds what you need to bring in, right, then that's not a problem at all. But just what I guess do you need to, so like, let's say like we have that map of Turner, right? And you have like the 3 or 4 on the bottom and then the handful kind of on the side up here. Say these ones were an urban reserve, and then you just wouldn't have to look at this at all because you know that that's enough acreage.
Yep, that is potentially the
just
case
yeah.
for cities that have urban reserves. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, let's go to Al.
Thanks. I sort of a question, I guess, maybe for Damien. Redmond and Bend have had different experiences in expanding the urban growth boundaries. Redmond had an urban reserve and was able to use that pretty effectively without appeals. Bend has had more trouble with its UGB expansions, and probably in part because it hasn't had urban reserves. And at present, it's kind of in a crunch because it's way, way down on this 20-year land supply. And I don't know where it is as far as an urban reserve study goes. Is Ben going to be going ahead with urban reserves, or is it going to go right into the UGB expansion process, Damien? And am I correct about Redmond?
Thanks, Al. You are correct about Redmond. They established an urban reserve around 2005 and sized it such that they could then expand their boundary into this reserve. And I think that was completed between 2006, 2007. With respect to Bend, we did recently receive, I think, a nodding of heads from the city council to proceed with an update of our comprehensive plan that would include, our focus on housing, but then down the road, once the urban growth boundary work is done and our plan is acknowledged, then proceeding into an urban reserve that we'd work with Deschutes County on.
Heather?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have to check now. So I think that along the lines of the study area that you have to look at when you're looking to expand. Eugene did adopt urban reserves a couple years ago. We actually did a pretty big, I think it's at the time was identified as a 27-year urban reserve. So it's pretty big. And yet I believe that Division 24, Section 65 would still require us to look a mile outside of, so that's what we were talking about. Yeah, I think if there was a way for, if you have urban reserves and you think that there's enough in there to meet what the need is, or it's like 2 times the amount or some metric, and not having to look at land that you basically already discounted because it's not in urban reserves, that would be great. So I want to second that. And then I think also once if you have some sort of metric that says, okay, you have enough urban reserves, that you have enough land, that you actually do have to narrow in on what the urban reserves your expansion area would be for, which would be our case. I just got from our urban reserves planner, ours is 55 5,900 developable acres, so pretty big. So we're going to have to do a lot of narrowing. And we are having already done a bunch of analysis for the urban reserves. It would be nice if there was some way to streamline the narrowing in of the urban reserves areas, so that you're not essentially kind of repeating a lot of the analysis that you already did. So just two things I wanted to piggyback on.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks for maybe putting, I didn't quite understand what you were getting at, Brock, but I see you nodding as Heather talks, and I saw Martha give a thumbs up as well. So
Yeah,
thanks for
thank you,
those.
Heather. That was exactly what I was trying to say. Thank you.
I want to make sure with the time we have left, we, think beyond just the urban reserves, going back to our question about, what aspects of the Goal 14 process, the boundary location process of establishing that study area and evaluating it under the 4 factors that we might want to consider. But we have a good list so far, but are there other elements of it that people think need clarity?
Yeah, I wanted to lift one up. I see here, it was a new addition to the mirror board, and I think it's related to one that's on the mirror board. So removal of unsuitable land. And I think it's under, it's probably under section 7, or I'm sorry, subsection 7 of 65. So in our division 24, so the removal of unsuitable land, and within that, what is serviceable or not? And Beth, you had mentioned in the example in Turner, you would have to go you would have to go beyond constrained land. And I think there might have been hill cliffs, or I don't remember if it was steep slopes or a ridge. And so that became really prohibitive, thinking about how you would provide services beyond that ridge and into anything within that half-mile buffer or that 1-mile buffer beyond that. But I think there's a variety of selections under unsuitable, and one of them is serviceable or not. Similar to our buildable lands inventory, if you're going to bring in land, and this is a really good image, Beth pointed out to us, you wouldn't want to bring in an active quarry. That didn't make a lot of sense. You wouldn't want to bring in constrained land with wetlands or FEMA flood hazard areas. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. But are there any other questions or clarifications, any experiences folks have with their findings on unsuitable land and what is or is not serviceable?
Mary Kyle?
This is just a caveat to what Con said. It's not really getting at the question yet, which is steep slopes and floodplains might be the kind of land one would bring in if you're also bringing in parks and open space and trails and such. So let's just remember, we're not talking the whole time about developing the land, but it wouldn't be buildable, but it might be if you're looking for it might be what you're considering for parks, natural areas, trails, etc. So
it's so funny you say that, because when Beth was at this, obviously I'd seen this slide previously, Beth,
right,
and it hadn't occurred to me until I saw it today. I was thinking of another city's UGB expansion that brought in a wildlife area.
Right.
I think
right.
what was unique, what struck me today, Beth, is when they brought in that wildlife, and I can't remember which city it was. Maybe it was Astoria. I can't remember. When they, within their UGB expansion, brought in this wildlife area, it was not brought in for residential development, to your point, Kyle.
Right.
But this struck me differently, Beth, in that if we wanted to develop beyond, so let's say the ridge is there, and that would be a natural area, not for residential development. But anything beyond that ridge, how do we get services there? What's the cost? And maybe I'd rather go with sub area D. Like that just seems like that'll be way down the road.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting bringing it in as a park makes it easier to serve on the other side of a ridge.
That's what I'm worried about this time.
Right. No, I don't. That's not what I mean. I just mean if you're having like a park need or trails or something like that.
Yeah,
that's
expansion
a different
for other
category
public
of land.
uses.
Right.
Yeah, your open space uses.
Corey?
Yeah, I've been kind of thinking back on what Beth was mentioning about sort of this new category of efficiency measures and kind of the agreements to be annexed, and there's a certain number of affordable units that there's a commitment to, or there's development agreements. And so what that made me think of is like the willing seller issue. And I know that that's a tricky one, but I know that that's often a real big barrier that shows up further down the line. And so is there room in this process? Is there room in this rulemaking when we say what should be in a study area, right? Like, is there some sort of way to account for or start to keep track of like who's actually willing, right? So I just kind of want to put that in the room because one of those ideas more around the efficiency measure thing made me think of that. But I think like looking at this kind of like, how do we figure out what should be under study or not? Like, I'm just curious if there's a room for us to kind of have a conversation about that because it is an issue. So just thought I'd throw that out there for the group.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. And I know that came up in our buildable land inventory discussion about whether something, or maybe development ready lands, about whether something stays on that list if it doesn't turn over in an HPS period or some other period of time. Brock?
Yeah, and Corey, I like that concept. The one thing I just want to tie it back to was and like you said, Steve, the conversation we had earlier about with the buildable lands inventory, and just whether that's creating a process that makes lower income areas up for more speculation if it's on a formal list like that. I don't have the right answer to it, but I just wanted to circle back to that just to bring it.
Thank you for reminding us of that. Al, go ahead.
Yeah, just on that issue, the record in every UGB expansion is different, of course, and it is very relevant to the analysis of the factors when someone comes in and explains that they've got a certain kind of farming operation going on next to a place that's relevant under one of the factors. It's also relevant if someone comes in and says that, well, this property over here that's in the urban reserves has a conservation easement on it. That belongs to the Trust for Public Lands or for whoever, that land is just not going to develop. On the other hand, there might be one where someone has said, look, if you will take me in before Joe, I'll put a covenant on my property that I'll be willing to sell it at market value, or that I'll be willing to do certain other kinds of things. So you can actually put evidence in the record about which properties have willing sellers and which don't. If that evidence isn't there, you kind of got to deal with what you've got, but it just does make it relevant as part of that Goal 14 factors analysis to look at those kinds of things. And in some cases, as I think someone suggested, there's the issue of conditioning annexations the way Ashland does, but it's also highly relevant. Someone just comes in and voluntarily says, look, I'm going to make this more likely because I can provide certain kinds of infrastructure, I can provide certain kinds of restrictions, those kinds of things. I've talked to John Chandler about this back in the day when we were working on this in Bend, and everybody agrees that doesn't come within the statutory limitation on price restrictions. Because if somebody says, I want to compete on the basis of affordability and I want to come in to the urban growth boundary this 20-year cycle instead of in 20 years, that's a relevant fact. And it's also relevant if someone says, I know this is the best property for the building industry or for low-income development, but I want to keep it as a farm and I just put a covenant on it. That's also relevant. So I think those are all facts that right now we need to look at under the factors. And I don't know if there's what we need to do in the way of rulemaking to reinforce that, but to the extent that we could, I think it could be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, Al. Any last, Beth's got her hand up.
So I just wanted to put out there that what Turner is not a good example of is an area that has a whole bunch of exceptions areas around it. This is Cresswell, where we haven't done this kind of analysis, but we're helping the city understand it. And so their first priority, since they don't have urban reserves, will certainly be looking at these exceptions areas that are not constrained. So like areas that we've got marked like 15 and 7 and, parts of these areas up here. And that, part of the struggle I think cities go through with these exceptions areas is that brings in a lot of cases, more land that's partially vacant. So it's got development at, half acre, 2 acres, 1.5 acres, so smaller parcelized, which I've seen cities struggle with, and I'm working with a different city and they're struggling with that right now. And I understand why that's a requirement. But it's certainly, I think, an interesting thing that will feed back into the questions of does land in your UGB develop over, the next 6, 8, 16, whatever years. Um, uh, so
Thanks, Beth. Well, I think this has been a good conversation. Beth, thank you for sharing your screen and providing the presentation. I think that was really helpful and everyone to kind of get their brains into this Goal 14 process. I want to hand it over to Kevin if you have any reflections as we get towards the end here and to talk about what's next.
Yeah, I think there's a few of these topics where we could delve into quite a bit more. There are other topics where we've thought about it a little bit and we could bring some thoughts around what rules could do for folks to react to. So I think there's a variety of different ways to go. What I'm looking on the Miro board thus far, Beth, what you just mentioned, I see it here, how to address existing rural residential subdivisions or just rural residential parcelization. We have a lot of this on our list, and what we have mapped out, this list is about 10 meetings with you all to really think through all the way urban reserves, land swaps, and digging into some of these issues over those next 10 meetings. So I think we've done an overview of kind of, we were calling it the gray area in between goal 10 and goal 14 about determination of land need in response to deficiency of capacity or land. And I think what we'll do is we'll take from the Miro board, pick a few out to delve into next meeting. Just a reminder to folks, I think several of the planners will be at a conference later this month. So our next meeting is going to land on a Tuesday, not a Thursday, October 15th, prior to that planning conference. But if you feel really strongly about one of the topics or a couple of the topics for next meeting, maybe we could use the Miro board as a poll. You could put a hash mark on somebody's topic and say, that's what I want to really get into. Otherwise, I think what we'll do is kind of spell out where we're going to go over the next 10 meetings so you guys can map that and kind of see the chronology of the topics we're about to cover. Mary Kyle?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the scattered rural development in exception areas. That is the definition of an exception area. That was known when they was considered a priority. They're not farmland. I mean, some have farming going on in them. But that's a policy choice that's been made. And I have also seen UGB expansions in the metro area and otherwise that have taken well over a decade to develop on flat farmland for other reasons, not scattered, rural development, but because builders over-speculated before the UGB expansion, paying way more than they should have. I can tell you exactly where that is and how much they paid per acre. And on infrastructure costs that have been increasing a lot, on other market forces that are outside anything in the land use planning process. So there's lots of reasons that go into why a particular piece of land that's outside of an urban growth boundary today may take a while to develop. So I don't want to high center on the fact that we have scattered rural development because that's how it's been planned for better or worse, right? So I'm just pushing back on that. It's one thing that is a reality of expanding urban growth boundaries to accommodate development.
Thank you, Mary Kyle. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I just think that's such a great tie. One of the topics we have planned for us is around coordinated public facility planning. When you think about green spaces and why they haven't developed, when you think about rural residential parcelization, why it hasn't developed. So I might really think on this, Mary Kyle, that I think we might just do a deep dive, Steve, at our next meeting to just tease it out. Let's really talk about when an expansion area is brought in, the various barriers, and then what's consideration for unsuitable when you're thinking about that next expansion. I think we have that mapped out in this discussion, and things are fluid right now, so that might work really well.
I think that sounds great. And I love all the activity on the mural board right now. It looks like bees buzzing around, pollinating the different ideas on the mural board. So thanks, everyone. That'll remain open for a bit. Patton, yes?
I think I might just try this out, that you guys will get a pre-mural board with each agenda. Because it's a dual place to interact and put thoughts. I know staff have contributed. Beth, I saw you contribute during the meeting. It's a really great place to capture a lot of what's happening. So yeah, I think I've got what we will focus in on next meeting. We'll see you on a Tuesday. And then I'll try to get, I want it to be fluid, but I'll get you a loose map of what the next 10 meetings are going to look like. So bear with us, be flexible with that map. We may shift things around, but that gives us an idea of where we're going. So I want to thank you all today. This was fantastic. It was quick. It was high level overview. And now we get into it deeper from here.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.